The name is Warren Langford, 70 years old. 4 decades I spent building a commercial real estate empire in Houston out of thin air, nothing handed to me, nothing inherited. I have gone toe-to-toe with cutthroat developers, weathered market collapses, and run boardrooms like a general commands a battlefield. Yet there I sat beneath the cold glare of those courtroom fluorescent lights, looking every bit the frail, senile old man they were so determined to convince the world I'd become. Welcome back to Dad Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along so you never miss what comes next. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. When a family member betrays your trust, do you confront them face to face, or do you go quiet and gather your evidence first? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely love to hear how you think. One more thing before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purposes of telling it. Any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. Directly across the aisle sat Renee, 45 years old, my wife of the past 12 years. She had dressed herself in a plain, dark, tailored dress, her hair drawn back tight, every trace of the lavish diamonds and designer labels I had showered on her over the years, deliberately stripped away. She was performing, and she was performing brilliantly. She pressed a crumpled tissue to the corners of her eyes, her shoulders trembling with soft, choreographed sobs. She was the portrait of a terrified, worn-down, abused wife. Standing right at her shoulder was her high-priced attorney, a man whose hourly rate was almost certainly being funded by my own accounts. He was hoisting a thick medical file toward the judge like a piece of damning evidence, his voice pitched to a grave theatrical register. He told the court that my condition had taken a sharp and rapid turn for the worse, that I was suffering from severe, sudden-onset dementia. He recited fabricated reports claiming my mind had come completely unmoored, that I was given to violent outbursts, and that I had become a genuine physical danger to my family, most of all to my young daughter. Hearing those words, a suffocating dread began clawing up through my chest. The full weight of what was happening hit me like a freight train. This was not a fight over bank accounts, properties, or a company. This was a fight for my basic human freedom. If the judge bought this performance, if that gavel fell in Renee's favor, every one of my legal rights would be stripped away. I would be locked inside a closed psychiatric ward, a prisoner of my own mind, while she and her accomplices picked apart everything I had bled to build. Watching her press another manufactured tear from her eye, my mind yanked me backward without warning. The pull was seamless, dragging me straight to the moment my entire world broke open. Exactly 3 months ago. The trembling in my hands had only just started showing itself back then. I was seated at the head of the long mahogany table in the boardroom of Langford Development, the room ringed by floor-to-ceiling glass windows framing the Houston skyline, a skyline I had helped shape with my own hands. I was deep in the middle of reviewing a highly sensitive multi-million-dollar commercial acquisition. My top executives were gathered around me, every one of them hanging on my next word. I was in complete control. Then the heavy glass doors swung open. It was not my secretary. It was a man in a cheap suit carrying a fat stack of manila envelopes. He walked straight past my security, came right up to the head of the table, and dropped the envelopes squarely on top of the acquisition documents. He met my eyes and announced clearly, "Warren Langford, you have been served." The boardroom went absolutely silent. My executives stared in stunned disbelief. My hands felt numb as I pulled the papers free from the envelope. It was a divorce petition filed by Renee, paired with an emergency restraining order barring me from my own home and a preliminary injunction freezing my personal assets. The documents alleged that I was mentally unstable, dangerous, and wholly incapable of rational judgment. Being served with a restraining order in front of my entire board was a deliberate strike engineered to erode my authority, plant doubt about my competence in my colleagues' minds, and publicly humiliate me inside the very empire I had constructed. I remember the hot rush of blood roaring in my ears that day. I remember the confused murmurs rippling through my team as I abruptly adjourned the meeting. I remember the frantic, desperate drive back to my estate, telling myself over and over that this had to be some colossal misunderstanding, a terrible, correctable mistake. But there was no mistake. Back now in the freezing courtroom, the memory of that humiliation stoked a quiet, burning fury inside me. I pulled my eyes from the judge and fixed them on Renee. She was lowering the tissue from her face, and for a fraction of a second, her gaze locked with mine. The frightened victim mask dissolved, replaced by something cold and completely hollow. I dropped my eyes to her hands resting on the plaintiff's table, perfectly manicured, perfectly steady, perfectly composed. Those were the same hands that had poured my coffee each morning, the same hands that had straightened my tie before every major corporate gala. And now those very hands were holding the legal blade pressed against my throat. I looked at the fraudulent medical file her attorney kept brandishing, then back at my own trembling fingers. My entire life I had depended on my intellect. My mind was my greatest asset. To hear a lawyer stand up in open court and announce that my greatest asset was rotting away, that was a psychological torture I can barely put into words. I remember staring at the medical seals on those documents, asking myself whether they might somehow be right. Were the memory lapses genuine? The moments of aggression? There is something uniquely terrifying about having the person who sleeps beside you every night tell you that you are losing your mind, then lay a stack of papers on the table to back it up. You begin to second-guess every word out of your mouth, every step you take. But the dead coldness in Renee's eyes in that unguarded split second told a different story entirely. It told me the trembling in my hands was not a disease. It was a symptom of something far darker. I simply had to prove it. I walked out of that boardroom in a state of blind shock. The silence from my board members trailed me down the hallway, thick and loaded with everything nobody was saying. The murmurs of my executives faded it into a flat ringing in my ears as I rode the elevator down to the garage. The concrete walls of the parking structure seemed to press inward around me. My hands clamped the steering wheel in a white-knuckled grip. The drive to my estate normally took 40 minutes. I covered it in 20. I ignored the speed limits, blew through 2 red lights, my heart hammering an erratic beat against my ribs. My mind sprinted through 1,000 explanations, reaching for anything that made the catastrophe logical. I told myself it was a colossal misunderstanding, a clerical error, a malicious stunt pulled by some bitter rival. Renee loved me. We had built a life together. There had to be a rational explanation. But when I turned onto the familiar tree-lined street of my neighborhood, the illusion gave way. The massive oaks that had always welcomed me home now threw long, threatening shadows across the road. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the house I had built, from nothing a home I had owned long before Renee ever entered my life. I rolled down the window and punched my access code into the keypad. A harsh red light blinked at me. I entered it again more carefully. Red light. I tried Renee's code. Red light. I tried the master override I had programmed myself 15 years ago. Red light. The system had been wiped clean. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I stepped from the car. I walked to the iron bars and looked through. Stacked haphazardly across the cobblestone driveway was my luggage. 7 expensive leather suitcases bulging and hastily zipped, left out like garbage. Next to them sat boxes overflowing with my personal files. books and framed photographs from my home office. They had not simply locked me out. They had erased every trace of me from the property. Before I could absorb the full scale of the betrayal, the heavy mahogany door swung open. I expected Renee, perhaps looking sheepish, perhaps ready to offer some explanation for the madness that had overtaken her. Instead, walking out onto the porch was Gavin. He was 42 years old, Renee's son from a previous marriage. I had taken him in when he was a young man adrift with no direction. I paid for his education. I mentored him. 5 years ago, over the objections of my senior partners, I had made him Chief Financial Officer of Langford Development. I had handed him the keys to the kingdom because I believed in him the way a man believes in his own blood. Gavin came down the driveway, slowly, hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He did not look angry. He did not look like someone who had just done something monstrous. He stopped just on the other side of the iron gate and regarded me through the bars with an expression of deep, sickeningly gentle concern. He exhaled slowly, giving his head a small, sorrowful shake. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet and soaked in false sympathy. "You shouldn't be out here driving yourself around in your condition." I seized the cold iron bars, my knuckles going white. "What condition, Gavin?" I shot back, my voice torn between fury and fear. "Open this gate right now. Where is your mother? What is the meaning of these bags dumped on my driveway?" Gavin stepped closer and laid his hand gently over mine on the gate. The condescension of it made my gut clench. "The doctors are telling us your mind is going, Dad. Every one of us has watched it happen across the last 6 months. The blanks, the rages, the disorientation. This is about keeping you safe and keeping the company intact. Every member of the board has been briefed, and they stand behind the medical findings. You cannot put a man in freefall behind the wheel of a billion-dollar operation. Step aside. Let people who are still sharp clean up what you have left behind. You are not well." Ice moved through me from head to foot. I looked into the eyes of the young man I had built from nothing, hunting for any crack of decency, any sign this was a bad joke. Nothing, just a cool, calculated blankness. "There is nothing wrong with me," I said, my voice going quiet and lethal. "You have zero authority here. This is my house. Every inch of this property belongs to me. I raised these walls with my own blood." Gavin tilted his head with a mournful, practiced sympathy. "I understand that is how it feels to you, Dad, but your sense of reality has been slipping for some time now. The filings are done, they cannot be undone. A judge already looked at your records and ruled that intervention could not wait. I will be running the firms day to day until you are back on your feet. There is a good hotel downtown, comfortable and equipped for your needs, and your belongings are already packed. Everything has been thought through. All you have to do now is rest." Every sentence of his landed like a fist. He had taken the genuine symptoms I had been quietly suffering, the unexplained exhaustion, the waves of dizziness, and reforged them into proof of irreversible ruin. He was conducting a quiet takeover, and my own body was his evidence. The urge to grab him was almost overwhelming. The urge to shout until the windows shook. But something drew my gaze upward past his shoulder, up the face of the house. Second floor, corner bedroom window. A small shape pressed against the glass. Nora, my 10-year-old daughter. My girl. Both her palms were flat on the pane, her eyes reaching down to find mine. What I saw in her face was not bewilderment. It was a stark, bone-white fright with nothing underneath it. Her gaze clung to mine like a plea. She had the look of someone trapped on the wrong side of a war. I drew breath to call her name, to promise her I was still her father, that I had not gone anywhere. But the words never formed. A figure rose in the glass behind her. Renee. My wife's perfectly manicured hand shot out and seized Nora by the shoulder without a word. Renee never once looked down toward the gate. In a single savage motion, she swept the heavy velvet curtain across the window. Darkness. My daughter was gone from view in an instant. I stood there on the cold pavement, unable to move. An afternoon breeze cut across the yard, but registered nothing on my skin. What registered, the only thing that registered, was the full weight of what had been done to me pressing down through my chest into the ground. Gavin did not say another word. He turned, walked the driveway back to the front door at a leisurely pace, and let it fall shut behind him. I was on the outside. Completely. I was 70 years old, alone on a public street. My hands trembling at my sides, every single thing I had built now behind a locked door. Those heavy oak estate doors were not going to open for me again, and some part of me already understood that. Before long, a private car glided to the curb, Gavin's arrangement without question, designed to make my exit as invisible as possible. The driver transferred my hastily packed bags to the trunk without acknowledging my existence. I lowered myself into the back seat. The shaking had migrated from my hands into the center of my chest, a low mechanical vibration I could not quiet. City lights smeared past the windows the whole way in. I was eventually dropped at one of those expensive, characterless, extended-stay hotels that cater to people with money and no home, right in the thick of the financial district. A front desk attendant surrendered a key card with the particular smile of someone trained to show compassion without feeling it. Entering the suite, I thought of tombs, beige walls with no opinion about anything. Furniture chosen for its geometry, not for comfort. No trace of a life lived, no pictures, no smell of something familiar, no accumulated small history. Just immaculate carpet and the relentless mechanical breath of the climate system. I set my coat down on the angular sofa and did not move for a long moment. 40 years of days packed with noise phones, urgent voices, blueprints unrolled across wide tables, a house full of motion, and now this. Absolute quiet. I turned to look at the 7 leather suitcases lined up near the entrance. Everything I was had been compressed into those bags. A spike of pain went through the space behind my eyes, sudden and sharp, and a wave of vertigo dropped me onto the edge of the bed. I raised both hands and studied them, still trembling. This was not simple shock responding to an awful day. It was mechanical, a steady, involuntary cycling that no act of will could interrupt. I told my fingers to go still. They kept moving. Something that had been held back for months finally came loose inside me. All the insidious planted doubt had been doing its work. My eyes closed, and the incidents they had used as evidence began running through my mind, one by one, relentless and sharp-edged. 6 months back was when the first gaps appeared. I had been on my feet at the head of a long conference table about to introduce a major investor, someone I had known for more than a decade. I opened my mouth, and his name was simply absent, erased. I stood there visibly struggling until Gavin moved smoothly into the silence and saved the moment for me. Then the rage started showing up. A hard-driving leader, yes, always. Cruel, never, not before. But 2 months ago, I had thrown a glass paperweight at a junior analyst because of a single typo on a zoning permit. I could still see the expression on that young man's face. I could still hear the low, careful whispers that spread through the office afterward. I had been a spectator, watching some other furious version of me act from inside my own body, and then the vertigo ambushing me in the evenings without warning so severe I had to lock both hands around the stair rail to avoid going down. Last week, had I actually destroyed that vase, I remembered the pieces of porcelain scattered across the hallway floor, and Renee with her back pressed to the wall, tearful, telling me I had swept it off the console table in a moment of total blind fury. I had no recollection of any such moment. But the evidence was on the floor. That uncertainty was its own kind of terror. I put both hands over my temples and held on as if the pressure alone could stop things from coming apart. What if they were not lying? What if the engine that had driven everything, the mind that assembled an empire from scratch, was genuinely failing? What if I truly had become dangerous to the people who needed me most? Even picturing it raising a hand toward Nora, my sweet and blameless 10-year-old, turned my stomach inside out. If the machinery really was broken beyond repair, then perhaps this empty beige room was exactly what I had coming. Perhaps Gavin and Renee were not predators. Perhaps they were right. That was the trap the isolation set. Every doubt fed the next, the hotel room, becoming a sealed chamber for my own fear to echo in. Then the telephone on the nightstand rang out hard and sudden, and I startled like a man who had forgotten the world could still reach him. I sat watching it ring. 3 times. 4. 5. I picked up the receiver, my hand barely steady. "Hello." My voice came out scraped and thin. "Warren, darling." Renee. Not the glacial, measured tone she had worn in the courtroom. Not the brusque, impatient edge in her voice when she had pulled the curtain on Nora. This was something else, the register I had fallen in love with. Soft, sorrowful, heavy with the weight of someone who claimed to be suffering. "Warren, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry that it reached this point. Are you all right? Is the room okay?" I tightened my grip on the receiver. "You locked me out of my own house. You had my belongings thrown onto the driveway like refuse. How is that something you could do to me?" A wet, unsteady breath came down the line. Then quiet crying. It had all the sound of something real. "I had no other path open to me, darling," she said softly, the words fraying at the edges. "Every night I lie there watching what is happening to you, and I cannot sleep. Seeing the man I love disappear piece by piece, it destroys me. But the aggression, Warren, you have no idea what you do. You cannot see it from inside it, but it is terrifying to witness. Nora needs to be protected. That comes before everything else. You were out of control last week. Things were thrown. No child should have to live through what she saw. Poison dressed as tenderness. It found every crack in my armor and seeped in. I pressed my eyes shut and felt one tear go. I do not want to hurt anyone." I whispered something inside me, splintering. "I know you do not," she said softly. "That is why you need to let us help you. Gavin is sending over temporary conservatorship papers tomorrow morning. It is just a formality, Warren. It will allow us to pay your medical bills, manage the company while you rest, and get you the specialized clinical care you desperately need right now. Please just sign the papers. Do it for Nora. Give yourself peace." The line went dead with a soft click. I lowered the receiver slowly back onto the cradle. The silence of that beige room settled around me, heavier than it had been before. I pushed myself up and crossed to the large mirror above the dresser. The man staring back at me looked like the stranger. Dark circles, gray skin, hands that would not stop shaking. I looked exactly like the broken, senile burden she had described. Every ounce of fight drained out of me. My head dropped, and I was defeated. The full weight of 40 years came down on my shoulders at once. I had nothing left to use against the people I had once sworn to protect. I was ready to sign it all away. Then a sharp, commanding knock cut through the heavy silence of the hotel room. I did not move. I just stared at the beige wood of the door, dreading what was waiting on the other side. The knock came again, louder. I hauled myself up from the edge of the bed, knees popping, the tremor in my right hand pulsing against my thigh as I walked over and pulled the handle. Gavin stood in the hallway. He wore a midnight blue suit, looking every bit the ruthless corporate executive I had trained him to be. A thick leather portfolio was tucked under his left arm. The moment he laid eyes on me, his face arranged itself into a mask of deep, agonizing pity. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, pulling the door shut behind him with a quiet click. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at you. You look exhausted. Have you been sleeping at all?" I did not answer. I walked back to the small glass dining table in the corner and sat down heavily. Gavin pulled up the chair across from me. He set the leather portfolio on the glass surface and unzipped it. "I hate to bring company business to you right now," he said, his eyes performing a practiced, mournful sympathy. "I know you need your rest, and Mom said you are having a very rough day. But the firm cannot stop turning. We have routine payroll approvals and a few quarter-end vendor contracts that the banks require the founding partner to authorize. It is just administrative red tape." I tried to focus on the documents he was drawing from the portfolio. My vision swam. The black ink on those stark white pages looked like a swarm of insects crawling across the surface. I blinked hard, trying to pull the text into focus, but a dull, throbbing ache began to build at the base of my skull. Gavin slid a heavy, silver-plated fountain pen across the glass toward me. "Just sign where the yellow tabs are, Dad. I will handle the rest. You do not need to strain your mind with the details right now. Just let me steer the ship while you recover." I reached for the pen. My fingers were shaking so badly that the silver barrel rattled against the glass before I could close my hand around it. I stared at my own hand as though it belonged to someone else entirely. A pathetic, broken thing. And as I sat there looking at those trembling fingers, a sharp, vivid memory tore right through the fog. It was 35 years ago. I was standing on a frozen, muddy lot on the east side of Houston, 5 in the morning, and the wind chill was 20 below zero. The general contractor had failed to show, and the cement trucks were already pouring. I did not own a suit back then. I had a heavy canvas jacket and thick work boots. I grabbed a shovel and stepped straight into the freezing sludge. I can still feel the burning ache in my muscles, the raw blisters tearing open across my palms as I leveled that concrete with my own hands. I built my very first commercial warehouse with blood, sweat, and calloused fingers that never once trembled. I was a man of iron and earth. I had dragged myself out of poverty and raised an empire across the city skyline. And now, 35 years later, in a sterile hotel room, I could not even lift a pen. The contrast was a physical agony, the ultimate humiliation. I squeezed my eyes shut, pushing the memory back, willing the strength to return. I finally managed to close my fingers around the cold metal. Gavin rose from his chair and came around to my side of the table. He leaned over me and laid a heavy hand on my left shoulder. "Take your time, Dad," he murmured. "There is no rush. We are here for you. We just want you to get better." As he leaned in to point at the first signature tab, his suit sleeve rode up slightly. The cuff of his white shirt slid back from his wrist. My eyes caught a flash of metallic blue and silver. I stopped breathing. On Gavin's wrist was a watch, but not just any watch. I have spent my entire life in rooms alongside billionaires, foreign investors, and banking magnates. I know wealth when I see it. It was a Patek Philippe Grand Complication, specifically the celestial model dark blue dial, the stars mapped across its face, a masterpiece of horology that retailed for no less than $500,000. And it was not a fake. The intricate, flawless movement of the tourbillon through the sapphire casing was unmistakable. I stared at that timepiece, and something in my mind cut clean through the heavy, drug-like fog that had been smothering my thoughts. The math came instantly, and it was undeniable. Gavin was my chief financial officer. I paid him a very generous, very comfortable salary of $350,000 a year. Even accounting for his annual bonuses, even with a flawless investment portfolio, there was no legitimate universe in which Gavin could casually wear a $500,000 watch on a Tuesday afternoon. He had more than his entire yearly salary strapped to his left wrist. The contradiction hit me like a bucket of ice water. The soothing tone, the sympathetic eyes, the whole narrative that I was losing my mind. All of it crashed violently against the obscene, unexplained wealth ticking away inches from my face. A spark of pure suspicion ignited somewhere deep in my chest. This was not dementia. This was not biological decline. I looked back down at the papers he claimed were routine authorizations. The words were still blurred, but the gut feeling was razor-sharp and screaming. I did not pull my arm away. I did not look up at his face. I kept my eyes on the page, letting my hand tremble as I pressed the pen to the signature line. I dragged the ink across, leaving a pathetic scrawl that barely resembled my name. I did it again and again, signing every single tab with the unsteady strokes of a dying man. I gave him exactly the performance he needed. "There you go, Dad," Gavin whispered carefully, drawing the documents back and slipping them into the portfolio. "You did great. Go lie down. I will check on you tomorrow." He patted my shoulder one final time and walked to the door. I sat frozen at the glass table and listened to it close behind him. A few seconds later, drifting faintly through the thin hotel walls, I heard Gavin whistling. A bright, cheerful tune, the sound of a man who had just won the lottery. I looked at my trembling hands, my heart turning to solid ice. 2 days passed before the family court granted a supervised visitation. My lawyers fought hard to secure 60 minutes in a public park. I arrived at Herman Park a full hour early. The Houston wind was biting, but I barely felt the cold. I sat on a wooden bench near the designated playground, my eyes fixed on the entrance path. Finally, a sleek black SUV pulled to the curb. My heart leaped into my throat as the rear door opened and out stepped a court-appointed social worker, followed closely by Renee. And then there was Nora, my beautiful, brilliant little girl. She was wearing the red wool coat I had bought for her last Christmas, but she looked so much smaller than I remembered. She walked with her head bowed, hands shoved deep into her pockets. Renee walked 2 steps behind her posture, rigid eyes scanning the park until they locked onto me. The animosity radiating from my wife was palpable. The social worker walked over to me, offering a brief professional nod as she laid out the strict terms of the visit. I was not to bring up the divorce. I was not to ask about the living arrangement. I was there solely to provide a normal, standard parental interaction. I agreed, keeping my voice steady even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to grab my daughter and run. Renee had planted herself exactly 10 ft away, leaning against the wrought iron fence at the edge of the playground. Her arms were folded across her chest, dark sunglasses hiding whatever was behind her eyes, but I could feel her watching us like a hawk. Every single move I made was being catalogued. I crouched down as Nora came toward me. I put on a warm, reassuring smile, fighting to keep the crushing despair from showing on my face. "Hi, sweetheart," I said softly. "I missed you so much." Nora stopped a few feet short. She did not rush into my arms the way she always had. She did not give me that bright, gap-toothed grin. She just stood there, small shoulders, tight eyes, flicking nervously toward Renee before landing briefly on me. "Hi, Dad," she murmured barely above a whisper. The unnatural quiet stretching between us was agonizing. This was a child who used to spend whole afternoons in my study chattering away about science projects and watercolor paintings while I pored over architectural blueprints. Now she looked like a prisoner, terrified of saying the wrong thing. I steered her toward a nearby picnic table and sat across from her. I tried to close the distance between us. I asked about her fourth-grade teacher. I asked whether she was still reading the fantasy novels we had picked out together at the bookstore downtown. She answered in single syllables, "Yes." "No, it is okay." Her hands stayed folded tightly in her lap, fingers picking at her cuticles until they were raw. I reached over and gently laid my hand on top of hers to stop the nervous picking. The instant my skin met hers, she flinched. It was subtle and heartbreaking, but I felt it. I looked into her eyes. They were brimming with tears she was refusing to let fall. She was trying so hard to hold herself together, trying to find her footing in a nightmare she had no way of understanding. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice light and easy for the benefit of the social worker scribbling notes nearby. "You know I love you, right?" I said to her. "Whatever is happening around us right now, you are the most important thing in this world to me." Nora nodded slowly. A single tear broke free and rolled down her cheek. She scrubbed it away quickly with the sleeve of her red coat, then threw a panicked glance back over her shoulder toward Renee. The hour dissolved faster than I ever could have imagined. The social worker stepped forward and checked her watch. "That is all the time we have for today, Mr. Langford," she said, polite but firm. "It is time to say goodbye." Those words landed like a physical blow. I got to my feet, knees aching. I worked to keep my composure intact, knowing that any outburst of emotion would be recorded and turned into a weapon against me in the upcoming custody hearings. I looked down at Nora. "I will see you soon, sweetheart," I told her, pouring a confidence into my voice I was not sure I actually possessed. "I will never stop fighting for you." Nora stood frozen for a moment. Then, shattering the invisible wall of fear that had held her in place for the entire hour, she lunged forward. She flung her arms around my waist and buried her face into my overcoat. I dropped to my knees on the cold pavement and pulled her small frame tight against me. Having my daughter back in my arms was overwhelming. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of her shampoo. But in that brief moment of embrace, while my body blocked her completely from Renee's line of sight, I felt a sudden, deliberate movement. Nora's tiny hand slid down my side and jammed itself quickly into the right pocket of my jacket. She forced something deep into the fabric. The movement was so fast, so urgent, that if I had not been hanging on her every breath, I might have missed it entirely. Before I could make sense of what had just happened, a sharp voice cut across the air. "That is enough, Warren." Renee came marching over her heels, striking the concrete hard. She reached down and grabbed Nora by the hand, physically pulling my daughter away from me. Nora did not resist. She let her mother drag her backward, her head dropped in submission. The social worker moved between us, acting as a human barrier to ensure the separation held. I stayed kneeling on the cold ground, watching as Renee walked my daughter back to the black SUV. The doors slammed, the engine turned over, and they were gone, leaving me alone in the freezing park. I rose slowly. The wind cut straight through my coat, but a different kind of cold was already spreading through my veins. My right hand hovered over the pocket of my jacket. I could feel the faint outline of whatever she had slipped inside a small, textured lump pressing against the silk lining. I was not about to pull it out in the open. The park was too public, and I knew Renee was thorough enough to have someone watching me. I turned and walked quickly toward the public restrooms near the recreational center. The concrete block building was damp and reeked of harsh chemical cleaners. I passed the rusted sinks, went to the last stall, and slid the heavy metal bolt home. The only sound in that tiled silence was my own shallow breathing. My hands were trembling again, but this time it had nothing to do with any alleged illness. It was raw adrenaline coursing through me. I reached into my pocket and drew out the small object. It was a tiny, crumpled scrap of lined notebook paper, torn in haste from a spiral binder. I pressed it flat against the top of the toilet paper dispenser, working out the deep creases with my thumb. Written in pencil in Nora's jagged, frightened handwriting were 7 words that utterly changed my reality. "Daddy, do not drink the orange juice." Those 7 words struck my chest with the force of a sledgehammer. I stood under the harsh fluorescent light of that public restroom, staring at the pencil marks until the letters began to blur. My breath snagged in my throat as a profound, bone-deep silence settled over my mind. For months I had been drowning in manufactured confusion, questioning my own sanity, accepting the terrifying story that my mind was slowly coming apart. But Nora, my sharp-eyed 10-year-old girl, had just handed me the key to my own prison. I leaned back against the cold tile wall, clutching that crumpled scrap of paper. The gut instinct, that primal alarm that had kept me alive and ahead of the game in the brutal world of commercial real estate for 4 decades, suddenly roared back to life. It was a visceral awakening. I shut my eyes and let my mind carefully trace back the timeline of my supposed dementia. I had to find the precise moment the rot had first taken hold. 6 months ago, it hit me like a spark dropped into gasoline. 6 months ago, my health was impeccable. I was running 3 miles a day, steering complex acquisitions and outmaneuvering men half my age. It was exactly 6 months ago that Renee came home from a supposed wellness retreat in Scottsdale with a brand new health regimen. She told me she was worried about my heart. She had consulted a naturopathic cardiologist who had prescribed a custom-blended liquid supplement. I brushed it off at first, telling her my own doctors were perfectly satisfied with my standard vitamins. But Renee kept at it. She brought out her softest voice, her most tender touches, crying quietly as she pleaded with me to take it for her peace of mind. She simply could not bear the thought of losing me to a sudden heart attack. Like a trusting fool, I gave in without asking a single further question. The daily routine hardened quickly into an absolute unbending ritual in our home. Every single night, exactly 1 hour before bed, Renee brought me a crystal glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. The supplement was supposedly bitter, so she insisted on blending it into the juice herself to cover the taste. I remembered how she would carry it into my study on a lacquered wooden tray and set it down gently on my desk. She would stand there watching me with a loving smile, refusing to leave until I had finished every drop. If I left even a quarter of the glass, she would pout and press it back into my hands, reminding me of her anxiety. I never thought twice about any of it at the time. I genuinely saw it as the ultimate act of a devoted wife caring for her aging husband. I never noticed the faint, chalky residue that settled at the very bottom of the glass. I never asked why she strictly forbade the housekeeping staff from preparing my evening drink. That nightly ritual was not an act of love. It was the careful, calculated administration of poison. The moment true clarity struck, I did what any engineer would do. I laid the evidence side by side. My symptoms on one track, the nightly orange juice ritual on the other. What I saw made my stomach turn. How had I missed something this obvious for so long? That crushing, suffocating fog never ambushed me during daylight hours. It came for me exclusively after dark, rolling in sometime around the hour I finished that glass. Come midnight, I was a ghost of myself, slurring, stumbling, barely tethered to the world around me. Every memory lapse they had paraded before judges and doctors as proof of my deterioration had occurred those same poisoned hours, late night, or the gray pre-dawn window before whatever she had fed me burned off. The rages, the shattered ceramics in the corridor, those were not a diseased mind unraveling. Those were a body convulsing under chemical assault, neurons misfiring because Renee had been lacing my drink with sedatives. I lifted my eyelids slowly and dropped my gaze to my own bare hands, spreading my fingers wide under the cold, fluorescent glare of that restroom. 3 days. That was how long it had been since they barred the estate doors and shipped me off to a sterile hotel room. 3 days of nothing crossing my lips, but bottled water and black coffee, not one swallow of Renee's nightly poison. I studied my outstretched hands, bracing for the tremor I had come to dread, that maddening, humiliating shake that had become my constant companion for months. Nothing. My hands were rock solid. Not the faintest quiver. That rhythmic, involuntary spasm, the one that had sent my pen clattering to the floor in front of Gavin, was dissolving. My body was already reclaiming itself now that the source of the contamination had been cut off. I could feel my central nervous system knitting back together. I turned my wrists over and squeezed both hands into fists, hard and deliberate. The strength I had grieved as permanently lost was still inside me, lying quiet, waiting. What followed was two things arriving almost simultaneously, a relief so vast it nearly buckled my knees, and behind it, a rage of an entirely different temperature. Not hot, but glacial, the kind that doesn't burn out. It just sits there, patient and lethal, like liquid nitrogen moving through your bloodstream. I was not dying. My mind was not caving in on itself. I was not a man surrendering to age. I was a target. A carefully selected, methodically poisoned target. Renee and Gavin had engineered this together, a deliberate, sustained campaign to hollow out my cognition, to strip me down to a helpless dependent who couldn't fight back, couldn't question the numbers, couldn't hold a pen steady long enough to read what he was signing. That was the whole design. Reduce me to rubble, then walk away with the empire. My board, my associates, the people who had known me for 30 years, all of them persuaded I was a deteriorating old fool. Even I had started to believe it. But their plan had a crack in it, one arrogant flaw they never accounted for. They expelled me before they were finished with me. Exiling me to that hotel was the worst mistake they ever made. The moment I crossed that threshold, the pipeline went dry. The poison stopped. And without meaning to, they handed me the single ingredient I had been missing, a clear head. I crossed the restroom to the rusted sink, turned the tap all the way cold, and drove both hands into the water, throwing it hard across my face. I scrubbed until the skin burned. I was washing something off, not just the chemical residue, but the broken, weeping man who had collapsed onto a park bench 10 minutes earlier. I caught myself in the cracked mirror. The face staring back was different already. The dull, ashen look was receding, replaced by something focused and predatory behind the eyes. The fog had begun its retreat, and beneath it the man who had outmaneuvered competitors across every corner of Houston's real estate market for decades was coming back online, pulling free from 6 months inside a chemical coma. I took Nora's note and folded it with great care, pressing it into my breast pocket, flat against my heart. My little girl had put herself at risk to pull me back from the edge. The debt ran in one direction now. I pushed through the restroom door. Outside, the winter wind hit me sharp and mean, and I didn't flinch. There was no room for flinching anymore. I had a clear, objective evidence, allies, and a strike delivered before they realized I had woken up. I want to go back a moment, because I stood in that restroom far longer than I've let on, eyes fixed on those jagged pencil letters until they were etched permanently behind my eyes. The fear pressed into that handwriting, the fear of a 10-year-old girl, landed like a fist between my ribs and knocked the wind clean out of me. 4 decades of surviving the most cutthroat arena in commercial real estate had sharpened something animal in me, a gut instinct that doesn't reason, it simply knows. That instinct seized the controls entirely. I folded the scrap of paper and buried it in my breast pocket close to my heart, then stepped out into the Houston wind that cut right through me. I never turned to look at the corner where the black SUV had gone. I just moved, and my stride picked up speed, with every block the winter cold scouring my face and stripping away the last chemical haze still clinging to my thoughts. I reached the hotel as the sun finished sinking behind the skyline, long, pale shadows stretching across the room's beige walls. I left the lights off. I lowered myself onto the edge of the rigid mattress, and in the near dark began reconstructing the timeline, every symptom, every episode laid out in sequence. The equation was brutally uncomplicated. 6 months back, Renee had presented me with a new regimen, a liquid cardiac supplement, dissolved nightly into fresh orange juice. No staff involvement permitted. She prepared it herself without exception, positioned herself at my desk, and stood there until I had finished every drop. When I examined the timeline of every fog episode, every tremor, every lapse, they clustered in a single window. Always after dark. Always after I drank what she brought me. Not one sip of that juice had touched my lips in 3 days, not since I was thrown out of my own home. I raised my hands and held them in the low light filtering through the curtains. The shaking was almost entirely gone. The mental haze that had smothered me for months was drawing back like a curtain lifted from a window. This was not early-onset dementia claiming me piece by piece. The woman I had loved was taking me apart molecule by molecule. That truth didn't shatter me. It transformed me, turned something soft into something cold and precise and extremely hazardous. I sat in the darkness and watched the clock on the nightstand count the minutes. Midnight came and went. 1 in the morning followed. I needed to know without any doubt that Gavin and Renee were sleeping soundly inside my estate before I moved. At exactly 2 in the morning, cold and absolutely lucid, I opened the laptop. The screen threw pale light across the darkened room. When I had brought Gavin in as Chief Financial Officer of Langford Development 5 years ago, I had placed the full weight of the company's finances in his hands. What I had not told him was what I kept for myself. I had spent too many years building an empire in a city where loyalty is a transaction, not a virtue. From the very beginning, I had preserved something, a read-only backdoor threaded quietly into the master ledgers invisible to anyone who came after me. A ghost protocol. Only 2 people had ever known it existed, me and a retired software architect whose career I had once salvaged and who repaid that debt with silence. I entered the string of proxy addresses and layered passwords, slipping past the security architecture Gavin had almost certainly built to keep me out. The system recognized the old ghost credentials without hesitation. I was inside, silent and visible at the core of my own company's financial machinery. Everything pivoted from the physical to the digital in that instant. I skipped past the polished executive interfaces and went straight for the raw transaction logs, the unvarnished record of every dollar that had moved. My hands were flying across the keyboard with a sharpness and confidence I hadn't experienced in 6 months. The fog was gone. I was operating on my own terrain again behind the lines. My entry point was the heavy silver-plated fountain pen, specifically what I had signed with it. I needed to reconstruct exactly what Gavin had slid across that hotel room table just hours ago, those papers he had steered me toward with such practiced, easy pressure, while a $500,000 watch gleamed on his wrist. Routine authorizations, he had called them, standard payroll and quarter-end vendor sign-offs that required the founding partner's hand. I pulled up the day's signature authorization queue. 5 files, all heavily encrypted, all carrying my unsteady, chemically degraded signature. I broke the seal on the first one and read, "Not payroll, not vendors." My blood temperature dropped. as I worked through the legal language packed into those pages. What I was holding were irrevocable transfer authorizations, untraceable, massive, final. Gavin had been systematically draining the primary corporate holding accounts, routing the funds into a constellation of shell limited liability companies incorporated in Delaware. I went into the ledger. $4 million moved to Summit Advisory Solutions. $6 million pushed through to Crestline Global Management. Another $5 million redirected into Meridian Consulting Group. Every entry filed under the same deliberately vague category: emergency legal and consulting fees, a label unassailable enough to buy time. I ran the Delaware corporate registrations. Whoever had constructed this had buried the trail deep beneath stacked layers of blind trusts and proxy directors. But strip all of that away, and the skeleton underneath was exactly the same. Every one of those shell companies had been incorporated exactly 6 months ago, right around the time Renee first set that glass of orange juice on my desk. Gavin wasn't simply positioning himself to inherit the company. He was actively gutting it. He was bleeding Langford Development dry, draining the operating capital that represented 40 years of my working life, all while keeping me too sedated and disoriented to notice. I leaned back in the chair, the blue glow of the laptop screen reflected in my eyes. The sheer magnitude of what he had taken was staggering. At the rate those transfers were moving, the company would hit insolvency inside 3 months. And when the board eventually noticed the missing millions and started pulling threads, every thread would lead back to the same place: authorization documents bearing my signature. Gavin had constructed the ideal crime. He was looting my empire and building a paper trail that pointed straight at a confused, cognitively impaired old man as the responsible party. If investigators came knocking, Gavin could step forward as the heartbroken son, hand over the ledgers with trembling hands, and mourn his father's tragic decline into dementia. The surge of adrenaline that hit me was so intense my jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at me to grab the phone call: the police demand their immediate arrest. I wanted to drive straight to the estate and haul them both out by the collar. I made myself stop. I drew a slow breath and studied the full picture the way a grandmaster surveys a board 3 moves from catastrophe. Going at them directly right now would be suicide. Renee would reframe my every accusation as a symptom of deterioration. Gavin would freeze my access before I could blink. Simply striking back wasn't enough. I needed to construct a trap so airtight they couldn't crawl out of it. The opening to do exactly that appeared less than 48 hours later. A courier arrived at my hotel room door with a formal summons to a mandatory mediation session, the first procedural move in their push for a permanent conservatorship and full control over Langford Development. I turned the heavy, cream-colored cardstock over in my hands and felt a cold, grim satisfaction settle in. They were pushing hard and fast, eager to lock me down legally before I could find an attorney willing to listen. They needed my mind to still be in pieces. I decided to show them exactly what they were counting on. I spent the morning building the performance with care. I let myself sleep badly so the shadows under my eyes deepened into something genuinely bruised. I put on a suit I deliberately left, crumpled the tie skewed off-center. The goal was simple: a man visibly losing his hold on ordinary life. When I entered the downtown conference room of their legal firm, the air was thick with the kind of tension that only exists when people believe they've already won. Renee was seated at the far end of the mahogany table, a pair of sharp attorneys flanking her on either side. She had chosen a subdued black dress, the devoted, long-suffering wife suffering beautifully. Gavin sat to her right, relaxed and at ease, wearing the quiet expression of a man watching his ship come in. He'd had the sense to leave the $500,000 watch at home, replacing it with a plain leather strap. The whole scene was suffocating in its calculated performance. I lowered myself into my chair, slowly letting my hands shake as I dragged it back from the table. I kept my eyes down, fixed on the wood grain, making no real contact with anyone across from me. Their lead attorney laid out the proposed terms in smooth, patronizing language: conservatorship, framed entirely as protection, as care, as something being done for my benefit. He walked through a catalog of my alleged failures, the outbursts, the memory gaps, the physical deterioration. Then he slid forward a buyout proposal for my shares, a figure so obscenely low it was less an offer than a slap dressed up as charity notionally earmarked for my medical expenses. I held myself still and let him talk for 20 minutes, keeping my breathing shallow and irregular. When he finally pushed the thick stack of preliminary documents across the table toward me, I knew the moment had arrived. I extended my right hand, letting it shake visibly. My fingertips brushed the edge of the papers, and then I sent the silver pen skidding off the table entirely. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that rang through the silence like a gunshot. I stared down at my empty hands and allowed my lower lip to tremble. "I'm sorry." I breathed, softening the words into a slurred murmur. "I can't seem to hold things properly today. My head is very bad right now." I raised my eyes and let my gaze drift unfocused before it settled on Renee. "I'm just so exhausted. I need to lie down. All these numbers, I don't understand any of it." Renee lifted her hand to her mouth on cue, manufacturing a restrained sob. She turned to her attorney with a look of exquisitely calibrated grief. "Oh, Warren," she said softly, her voice soaked in false tenderness. "We know how tired you are. That's exactly why we're doing this, so you can rest. You don't have to carry the numbers anymore." Gavin leaned in toward the table, lacing his fingers together. "It's all right, Dad. We don't have to push through today. Just give us your verbal agreement that you accept the basic framework, and we'll handle the formal signatures on a day when you're feeling stronger. We just need to hear that you're with us." I let my chin dip slightly, eyes drifting across the blank pages in front of me. "I understand," I said quietly, releasing what sounded like an exhausted surrender. "If the doctors believe this is right, if it means Nora will be safe, then I'll consider the terms. I just need to rest." The relief that spread across their side of the table was almost physically repulsive. Gavin and Renee traded a quick glance, barely perceptible, but I caught it, the microscopic signal of triumph passing between them. They believed they had done it. They had broken Warren Langford. The great man was a hollow ruin ready to fold without a word of resistance. Their attorneys began collecting documents with smirks they didn't quite bother to hide. The moment I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the cold afternoon air, every trace of that broken old man dissolved. My spine straightened on its own. My hands were perfectly still. The haze of that conference room fell away, and something crystalline and predatory snapped into focus in its place. I didn't go back to the hotel. Instead, I walked 3 blocks south to a private parking garage where I had rented an anonymous sedan that morning, paid for with a prepaid debit card and nothing else. I got behind the wheel, locked the doors, and pulled out into traffic. I took the interstate and put Houston behind me, driving for 3 solid hours until I had crossed state lines into Louisiana. I needed distance, physical and legal, between myself and the network Renee had spent years cultivating. She was embedded in the local medical establishment in ways I was only beginning to understand. Showing up at any nearby hospital would be walking into her web. Results could be manipulated or quietly passed along to one of her well-placed contacts. I couldn't afford a single weak link in what I was building. I drove the highway in silence, mentally calculating the half-life of whatever compound she had been administering. I needed scientific evidence so solid and precise that no attorney on earth could chip away at it. Near sunset, I turned off into the parking lot of a small independent toxicology clinic, tucked inside a nondescript suburban medical complex. The facility handled heavy metal screenings, chemical dependency assessments, and corporate evaluations, exactly the kind of quiet, specialized operation I needed. I went in through the glass doors and stepped up to the front desk. I paid entirely in cash, gave a false name, and provided an untraceable mailing address I had set up years back for contingencies exactly like this one. The woman at reception processed the paperwork without asking about my out-of-state plates or my insistence on full anonymity. I settled into the waiting room and filled out the intake forms requesting the broadest chemical panel. They offered heavy sedatives, neurotoxins, synthetic agents capable of mimicking neurological deterioration. When the nurse called my assumed name, I followed her back to the examination room. She secured the tourniquet around my arm, found the vein, and I watched dark red blood move steadily into the collection vials. With every tube that filled, I felt something close to vindication, quiet, resolute, final. This was the proof of what they had done to me. After the draw, the clinician cut a small section of hair from close to my scalp and sealed it in a labeled plastic bag. That hair sample was the ultimate piece of insurance. Blood could only speak to recent exposure days, perhaps a week. Hair told an entirely different story, a precise month-by-month record that would establish exactly when the substance first appeared in my system, locking Renee's nightly orange juice ritual into an irrefutable chronology of deliberate, sustained poisoning. I signed the chain of custody forms with a hand that didn't waver for a second, and walked out of that clinic carrying the truth. The drive back took me far from the polished glass towers of the financial district. I steered the rental through the decaying industrial fringe of the city, where streetlights sputtered and the asphalt had buckled and split beneath years of neglect. I turned into the gravel lot of a rundown all-night diner, the kind of establishment that carries the permanent smell of stale grease, old coffee, and lives that didn't go according to plan. Neon tubing buzzed above the entrance, throwing a sickly red wash across the cracked lot. An invisible, forgotten corner of the world. That was precisely what I required. I shouldered through the heavy glass door, a small bell offering a feeble announcement overhead. The place was nearly empty, a weary waitress dragging a cloth across the counter, and a single figure occupying the back booth. I moved past the vacant vinyl seats and settled in across from him. Clifford Dunning didn't look up right away. He kept drawing slow circles in his black coffee with the spoon. Clifford had been my original corporate attorney 4 decades back, when I was still a hungry contractor, hauling concrete and scrapping for permits. He was the hard-edged legal mind who had helped me build the framework that became Langford Development. He had always understood that in this city, the law wasn't something you hid behind. It was something you swung. Gavin and Renee were under the impression Clifford had walked away from practice a decade ago, retreating to a golf course somewhere in Florida. They assumed the only counsel I had left was the legal team they had already gotten to. They were mistaken. Clifford had never genuinely stepped away. He had pulled back into the quiet, maintaining a discreet and highly profitable private practice serving a handful of clients who required absolute confidentiality above everything else. He raised his eyes to mine pale blue, just as sharp and unsparing as they had been 40 years ago. One look at my face and the spoon came to rest on the saucer. "You look like hell, Warren," he said, his voice carrying a graveled rasp. I reached for the plastic pitcher and poured myself a glass of water. "I feel like hell, Clifford, but my head is clearer than it's been in months." I slipped my hand into my inner jacket pocket and drew out the folded financial printouts I had pulled from the company ledgers during my late-night ghost session. I pressed them flat against the sticky laminate tabletop and pushed them across to him. Clifford produced a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and went to work. For the next 10 minutes, the only sounds in our booth were the shuffle of papers and the distant hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. I watched his expression travel from casual attention to a cold, hardened, professional fury. A weathered finger moved along the wire transfer logs, his eyes tightening at the Delaware shell entities Gavin had built. "They're bleeding you out," Clifford said quietly, still not lifting his eyes from the page. 6 million here, 5 million there. This is a systematic, sophisticated embezzlement operation dressed up as emergency consulting fees. The signatures authorizing every one of those transfers are mine, I replied, my voice flat. But I didn't put them there willingly. I've been chemically poisoned, Clifford. 6 months of heavy sedatives and neurotoxins fed to me nightly to manufacture every symptom of early-onset dementia. They waited until my cognition was fully compromised, got me alone in a hotel room, and handed me a pen. I've just come from an independent toxicology clinic. Blood and hair samples are secured. Within a week, I'll have the scientific documentation to prove what they did to me, evidence no court can dismiss. Clifford set his glasses slowly on the table. He leaned back against the vinyl and regarded me with a look that was somewhere between deep respect and something close to awe. "You're not looking for a defense attorney, Warren? You want an executioner." I held his gaze and gave one measured nod. "I want to build a legal guillotine, and I want them to be the ones who release the blade." Clifford didn't waste a second. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a fresh white legal pad. "We don't block their moves," he said, his pen poised above the page. "Shaku, we annihilate the entire board they're playing on. If we surface now with partial evidence and suspicions, they'll file for an emergency psychiatric hold before the day is out. They'll use your medical records Renee has been carefully shaping to paint you as severely paranoid. We have to remain completely invisible. First order of business, we protect the remaining capital. Tonight, I'm going to quietly draft an irrevocable trust. Your entire personal fortune goes into it, every property, every untouched investment portfolio. You remain the sole beneficiary. I become the designated trustee. The moment Gavin moves to raid your personal accounts to complete his takeover, he'll run straight into a wall. That money will simply no longer exist in your name. They'll find the vault locked and empty." A grim, tight smile worked its way to the corners of my mouth. "And the company ledgers?" I asked. "Gavin is still draining the corporate operating accounts. If he discovers the personal funds are gone, he'll accelerate the corporate theft to grab whatever's left." Clifford let out a low, humorless laugh. "Let him move. I've maintained relationships inside the Federal Banking Commission, men who have owed me since the old days. I'm going to file a classified emergency alert targeting those specific Delaware wire transfers. The shell companies get flagged for suspected money laundering and corporate fraud. The Commission will immediately place a covert tracking monitor on every account Gavin is touching. He'll believe he's moving millions in complete secrecy. What he'll actually be doing is feeding a live documented evidence stream directly into a federal investigation. The elegance of it was in what Gavin and Renee would never see. They would press on with their campaign, filing their fraudulent documents, wiring their stolen millions with no awareness whatsoever that the ground beneath every step had already been undermined. Every forged document Gavin submitted, every dollar he moved, would simply add more weight to the sentence already being built for him. "What's my role in all of this?" I asked, pushing the empty water glass aside. Clifford leaned forward and fixed me with a direct, unblinking look. "You go back to that hotel. You drink your black coffee. You keep your distance from Renee. And above everything else, you hold the performance together. You give them the broken, senile, dying old man they need you to be. You stumble. You slur. You let them feel powerful. You make them feel like they're untouchable gods. Warren, the higher they climb on that pedestal of arrogance, the further they have to fall when we finally pull the floor out from under them. I nodded without a word, drew a long, slow breath, and got to my feet. I buttoned my coat, turned, and walked out into the freezing night, ready to inhabit my final role. I left the diner and drove straight to a secluded payphone near the edge of the industrial district. Before we'd parted, Clifford had pressed a sealed envelope into my hand. One name, one burner number. The man answered on the first ring. His name was Brock, a former intelligence operative who had converted his specialized military skill set into a private service commanding enormous fees. A standard investigator with a camera and a parked car wasn't going to cut it. I needed a ghost. We met an hour later in the underground parking structure of an abandoned shopping center. Brock was built like a vault door, compact, dense, and absolutely still, with eyes that gave away nothing at all. I passed him a thick manila folder containing blueprints of the Langford Development corporate headquarters, the makes and models of Gavin's vehicles, and $20,000 in untraceable cash. I laid out his primary directive. Renee was to be left completely alone. She was a precision architect of deception, meticulous, controlled, far too disciplined to leave a digital trail or speak carelessly anywhere she might be observed. Gavin was an entirely different problem. Gavin was drunk on his own newly acquired power. He was an arrogant amateur running a billionaire's playbook, blinding himself with expensive timepieces and authority he hadn't earned. Arrogance always manufactures carelessness. Brock took the folder without a word. By tomorrow morning, he told me my chief financial officer would be completely wired. He had military-grade audio surveillance equipment, capable of defeating standard corporate sweeps. Microscopic transmitters would go inside the leather headliner of Gavin's luxury sports car and deep inside the ventilation system of his executive suite. I drove back to the beige hotel room, my pulse carrying a low, steady, dark current of anticipation. The days that followed pushed me to the outer edge of what I could endure. Holding the performance of a deteriorating, senile old man together in public was manageable. What was almost unbearable was the psychological punishment of sitting alone inside that hotel suite with nothing but time. I wore grooves in the floorboards with my pacing, my feet aching from the hours, my mind cycling through 1,000 terrible scenarios. Every time my eyes landed on the digital clock beside the bed, I felt the pressure of it physically in my chest. Every hour that passed was another hour Gavin was moving money out of my corporate accounts. The empire I had assembled with rough hands and years of sleepless nights was actively hemorrhaging. I had to hold myself back from the ledgers by force of will. What I was about to uncover in that next stretch of silence would shake the foundation of everything I thought I understood about the people closest to me. The weight of it nearly broke me before I could act. Tell me, if you suspected someone you loved was working against you, would you confront them immediately? Or would you wait and watch until you had everything you needed? I couldn't risk Gavin spotting a ghost login while Clifford was quietly laying the trap with the Federal Banking Commission. I had to sit back and let them steal from me. I had to hold still and watch the water creep higher, trusting that the architecture of the plan would hold. The helplessness was its own particular kind of torture. I sat staring at blank walls, listening to the monotonous drone of the air conditioning unit, feeling severed from the world I had spent a lifetime building. My phone stayed silent. I had made it absolutely clear to Clifford and Brock that my primary line was off limits. I'd picked up a cheap disposable from a corner store and left it sitting on the glass dining table, waiting for Brock to transmit the encrypted audio files. The quiet pressed in from every direction. But the bleeding money wasn't actually what was tearing me apart. Money has a way of coming back. Companies can be reconstructed. What robbed me of sleep, what haunted every hour, was the image of my daughter. Nora was inside that sprawling estate with people who wished her father dead. I pulled the crumpled scrap of notebook paper from my jacket pocket and pressed it flat against the glass table for what felt like the 100th time. "Daddy, do not drink the orange juice." Her handwriting jagged, frightened unmistakably. A child's cracked something open in my chest every time I read it. My brilliant 10-year-old girl had seen through the assassination attempt before I had. She had detected the truth concealed behind Renee's warm smiles. Now she was alone on the wrong side of the wire, surrounded by people whose entire scheme depended on destroying her father. I pictured her at the long dining table, eyes down, quietly eating her dinner, while Renee and Gavin spoke calmly about my mental deterioration. I wondered whether Renee was watching Nora the way she had watched me in the park. Was my daughter safe? Was she lying in her room, waiting for me to come for her? The image of Renee's manicured hands anywhere near my child ignited something primal and violent in me. I wanted to tear the hotel door from its frame, drive straight to the estate, and rip through the iron gates with nothing but my hands. I wanted to go in and carry Nora out of that poisoned house. But I knew that was precisely the move Renee was counting on. The moment I appeared at those gates, screaming, demanding my daughter, the police would be called. Before I reached the front steps, the conservatorship would be locked in immediately. I'd be committed to a psychiatric unit, and Nora would be left entirely at their disposal permanently. I had to become invisible. I had to be patient. Every drop of fury and pride had to be redirected, converted into the trap they didn't know was being built around them. I spent the third day sitting alone in the dark, eyes fixed on that disposable phone. I ran through the next mediation performance in my head, rehearsing it the way an actor runs lines before opening night. I practiced the tremors, calibrating my hands to shake with the precise biological rhythm of a genuinely failing nervous system. I worked on the slurred speech, the downcast eyes, the vacant expression, the complete hollowness they required me to project. Humiliating work, degrading work, but it was the armor I had to wear. By the fourth afternoon, the isolation had started warping my sense of time. The beige walls seemed to press inward. The air felt heavier and staler with every hour. My mind went to Brock. Had his team been caught attempting to place the devices inside a heavily secured corporate building? Had Gavin's security detail swept the sports car and found the hidden audio transmitters before a single word was captured? Doubt is the enemy of any well-constructed plan, and isolation is the perfect incubator for it. Then, as the sun dropped and long gray shadows stretched across the carpet, the disposable phone finally vibrated. That harsh buzz detonated the silence of the suite. I was across the room in an instant, snatching up the device with hands that didn't waver. The screen came alive with a single anonymous text, an encrypted web link, and a long alphanumeric password sequence. Brock had gotten through. I opened the laptop, fingers working fast and precise across the keyboard. I entered the credentials, cleared the security gateways, and pulled down the first batch of compressed audio files. I fitted the noise-canceling headphones over my ears and hit play. A luxury car engine roaring to life filled my head, sharp, clear, and intimate. The suffocating wait was over. The real hunt for what had been stolen from my family was now underway. I remained in that dim hotel, headphones pressed tight to my ears, for 3 more days, working through the covert audio feeds streaming in from Gavin's luxury sports car and his executive suite. I heard the sneering confidence in my stepson's voice as he directed more fraudulent wire transfers. I heard him and Renee discussing my impending commitment to a psychiatric facility over the phone with the same casual ease you'd use to plan a dinner reservation. The recordings were infuriating, but they were financial pieces. The The real weapon was coming separately. The digital clock on the nightstand turned to exactly 9 in the morning, when a firm, authoritative knock cut through the quiet suite. I pulled off the headphones, my pulse settling into a cold and steady rhythm. I went to the door and opened it. A private courier stood in the hallway, expression entirely neutral. He extended a thick, heavily sealed envelope bearing the discreet emblem of the Independent Toxicology Clinic in Louisiana. I signed the electronic tablet. My hand perfectly still took the envelope and closed the door. I carried it to the glass dining table, the one surface in this beige prison that had become something like a command center. I didn't tear it open. I set both hands flat on the surface of the envelope and just held them there, feeling the weight of what was inside. This was the edge. The moment I broke that seal, there was no version of events in which I was the confused, deteriorating old man ever again. What was inside would replace that fiction with something far darker. The disposable phone began buzzing violently against the glass, making me flinch. Restricted number on the screen. I picked it up and pressed it to my ear. "Mr. Langford," the voice said. It was Dr. Vanek, the lead toxicologist from the clinic. No greeting, no preamble. His tone was grave, the gravity of a man delivering a diagnosis he wishes he didn't have to give. "I have your results in front of me," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I sent the physical copies by courier, but I felt a moral obligation to reach you the moment the laboratory confirmed the final chemical breakdown." I looked down at the sealed envelope on the table. "Go ahead, doctor," I said, my voice entirely level. "Give me the truth." Dr. Vanek exhaled, long, slow, waited. "Mr. Langford, we ran a complete analysis on the hair follicle samples you provided. Hair follicles are precise biological record keepers. Every substance introduced into the body is registered in them, laid down in exact chronological sequence. What your samples show is not a natural cognitive deterioration. It is not an autoimmune condition. What we are looking at is a deliberate, sustained chemical assault." Those words settled into the room and stayed there, confirming what Nora's note had planted in my gut weeks ago. "Be specific, doctor," I said quietly. "Tell me exactly what was in my system." Paper rustled on his end. "Your body contains an escalating multi-compound cocktail of toxins," Dr. Vanek said. "The first layer we identified was dangerous concentrations of thallium and arsenic. Both are highly toxic heavy metals that over sustained exposure methodically dismantle the central nervous system. Like they produce profound fatigue, severe muscular tremors, and a complete breakdown of physical coordination." "That accounts for the shaking hands," I said, and the image of the silver pen skittering off the mediation room table surfaced in my mind involuntarily. "Yes," he confirmed. "But the heavy metals were only one component, the physical layer. The cognitive symptoms, the sudden memory failures, the aggressive outbursts, the suffocating brain fog, those originated from a second compound entirely. We detected substantial quantities of a high-grade off-market synthetic sedative. It is structurally related to flunitrazepam, but it has been chemically modified specifically to defeat standard medical screenings. It suppresses the frontal lobe, eliminates short-term memory consolidation, and produces severe paranoia and emotional dysregulation. It is in effect a chemical straitjacket engineered to fracture a person's mind from the inside." I shut my eyes. Renee was standing in my study, smiling with perfect warmth as she set that glass of freshly squeezed orange juice on my desk. She had watched me drink arsenic and synthetic tranquilizers every single night. She had kissed my cheek while she dismantled me one glass at a time. The deliberate, patient evil of what she had built into a daily ritual was almost beyond my ability to process. "How long?" I asked, my voice dropping to something cold and quiet. How long have I been consuming this? The timeline recorded in your hair follicles is completely unambiguous, Dr. Vanek said. Exposure began exactly 6 months ago. The heavy metal deposits are trace level at the start, barely detectable. Then they climb in concentration week over week in a steady and deliberate escalation. Whoever has been administering this is extraordinarily patient and precise. The dosage has been raised, incrementally calibrated to mimic a naturally progressing neurological disease without triggering the kind of acute medical event that would draw scrutiny. My grip tightened on the edge of the glass table. What would have happened if the exposure had continued? I asked. The pause on the line was cold enough to feel. Dr. Vanek cleared his throat. Mr. Langford, based on the accumulation curve we see in your most recent hair growth, you were closing in on a critical toxicity threshold. Had you continued ingesting this specific compound for another 2 months, your central nervous system would have ceased to function. The heavy metals would have triggered massive cardiac arrest. And even if your heart had somehow withstood that the synthetic sedatives were actively dissolving your neural pathways, within 60 days the brain damage would have been permanent and irreversible. You would have spent whatever remained of your life locked inside a state of total, profound dementia. The phone shifted in my palm, which had gone slick with sweat. 2 months. 60 days. That was the gap between the man speaking on this phone and a slow, agonizing end. Renee and Gavin were not simply executing a hostile corporate seizure. They weren't just stripping away my money, my properties, and everything I'd spent my life constructing. They were killing me. Deliberately. Patiently. What I had believed was a brutal civil and financial dispute had just revealed itself as a premeditated criminal homicide. "Thank you, doctor," I said quietly into the phone. "You have saved my life." I ended the call and set the disposable device on the table. I reached out and split open the heavy envelope, drawing out the thick sheaf of laboratory reports inside. I stared at the dense columns of data, the graphs charting the deliberate engineered arc of my destruction. This was no longer a theory I was holding on to. It was no longer a desperate instinct or a suspicion I couldn't prove. It was documented medical fact. My wife and the boy I had raised as a son were calculated, cold-blooded assassins who had used my own home against me. They had turned my trust and my love into a delivery mechanism for poison. I was no longer a victim trying to survive. I was the architect of everything that was about to happen to them. The hour for mercy had closed. Brock arrived at my hotel suite less than an hour after the toxicology report had confirmed the full scope of what they'd done to me. He didn't knock in the ordinary way. He tapped a hollow rhythmic sequence against the wood, the signal we'd worked out during our brief exchange in the underground parking structure. I opened the door to find him filling the dim hallway, his frame throwing a long shadow across the carpet behind him. He came inside, sweeping the room with a practiced, unhurried look, then reached into the deep pocket of his dark tactical jacket. He set a small, matte black USB drive, heavy for its size, at the center of the glass dining table. No dramatic delivery, no unnecessary words. He gave a single nod, eyes carrying nothing resembling emotion, and told me the extraction had gone without a problem. The feeds from the executive suite and the sports car were fully captured and encrypted on the drive. Before I could get a word of thanks out, Brock turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. The mechanical click of the latch hung in the silence, and I was alone with whatever my family had said when they believed no one was listening. I sat at the table and looked at the small black device for a moment. My hands entirely steady now, the toxins draining out of me day by day, picked it up. I inserted it into the laptop's side port. A prompt appeared at once requesting the alphanumeric decryption sequence Brock had given me. I typed it out deliberately, one character at a time. The progress bar filled itself across the screen in a wash of pale green, and the master folder opened. It was organized with precision, sorted by time, date, and location. Dozens of audio files covering the previous 72 hours. I scrolled past the entries labeled with Gavin's car, bypassing the morning drives and the afternoon calls, looking specifically for files originating from his executive suite, the inner chamber, where I imagined him coordinating the final moves of his embezzlement scheme. I found one flagged from late Friday night, well after the building would have emptied for the weekend. The timestamp showed it starting just before midnight. I assumed Gavin had stayed late to push stolen funds through international accounts under the cover of darkness. I seated the noise-canceling headphones over my ears, set the volume, and hit play. I settled back in the chair, bracing to hear the cold arithmetic of my own financial dismantling. The audio quality was almost startling, crisp and immersive, capturing the full acoustic depth of the large room. I heard the solid, familiar thud of the heavy mahogany office door pulling shut. Then a sharp, metallic snap followed. The deadbolt driving home from the inside. A dense, stifling silence stretched across the recording for several long seconds. I was expecting keyboard sounds, the shuffle of ledger pages. What I heard instead was a slow, soft exhale, then whispering. It was Renee. Her voice was low, close, saturated with an intimacy that made my skin go cold. I stopped breathing. She murmured Gavin's name, drawing each syllable out with a deliberate, sickening tenderness. I heard the sound of expensive fabric shifting silk moving against leather upholstery. Then Gavin's voice came through. Low, thick, stripped of every pretense. The feed captured the unmistakable sound of an aggressive kiss. The reality of what I was hearing crashed into me with the force of something structural giving way. This was not a late-night strategy session about offshore shell companies. This was not a quiet discussion about the timetable for my psychiatric commitment. This was something else entirely, something grotesque, depraved, the deepest possible expression of their betrayal. My 45-year-old wife and my 42-year-old stepson were conducting an affair inside the walls of my own company. I sat locked in place, physically incapable of pulling the headphones from my ears, while the audio constructed an explicit and inescapable portrait of their moral corruption. I heard them moving through the office, sending what sounded like a heavy crystal decanter off the corner of the executive desk. They were unguarded, even laughing quietly as they shed their clothing. Their intimacy played out across the pristine audio feed, and threaded through it were their voices murmuring to each other between breaths. Renee whispered about how easily I had believed everything, how pitiful it had been to watch me trembling in my chair while she brought me my nightly poison. Gavin laughed, a thick, contemptuous sound that moved through me like something corrosive. He told her how much he relished watching her perform. The devoted wife called her a brilliant and ruthless actress. The betrayal sheared through me, cutting loose whatever was left of my composure. The financial theft, the coup, even the systematic chemical poisoning, all of it receded against the sheer repulsive weight of this. They weren't only stealing my company. They were making a spectacle of my life, turning my home and my marriage into something to laugh about in the dark. They were desecrating the idea of the family I believed we were. A wave of violent nausea rose from somewhere deep and uncontrollable. I wrenched the headphones off this plastic frame, cracking hard against the edge of the glass table as I threw them down. I lurched out of the chair, my vision narrowing to dark, pulsing edges. I barely cleared the bathroom doorway before I went down onto the cold tile floor, my body emptying itself into the porcelain bowl. I remained there a long time, chest-heaving, throat scorched, everything in me wrung out. The tile was cold and offered nothing. Their laughter kept cycling through my head, relentless and vivid, refusing to stop. The depths of what they were capable of sat beyond anything I had words for. I had brought Gavin into my house. I had paid for his schooling. I had placed the full weight of a billion-dollar enterprise in his hands. I had loved Renee with everything I had, without reservation, without conditions. I had given her my health, my trust, the unguarded interior of my life. And they had taken that devotion and turned it into a vehicle for poisoning me slowly while making my marriage into something vile behind closed doors. I pushed myself off the floor, muscles aching with a deep, bone-level exhaustion. I turned the brass faucet and drove cold water across my face, scrubbing until the skin burned. I took the rough white towel and dried my face slowly, then raised my eyes to the mirror. The face staring back at me from the mirror was unrecognizable. The devastated, shell-shocked husband, the one who had wept and refused to believe, was gone, buried under the weight of irrefutable recordings and toxicology findings. The devoted father who had clung to the idea that his family held some shred of decency had ceased to exist. What remained was something colder, something merciless and predatory. I turned away from the mirror and walked back into the room, each step measured, deliberate, loaded with intent. The hotel suite had changed its character entirely. It was no longer somewhere to hide. It was a command post. I lowered myself back into the chair at the glass dining table, eyes fixed on the plastic headphones sitting right where I had hurled them. The raw physical shock of what those two had been doing together had incinerated whatever scraps of blind faith I had left. I lifted the headphones and fitted them over my ears with slow precision. I moved the cursor to the trackpad and hit play, steeling myself for whatever came next. The audio picked back up where it had cut off. Their breathless, spent laughter wound down, gradually replaced by the chime of crystal and the glug of expensive scotch being poured. Gavin cleared his throat, his voice settling back into that smooth boardroom arrogance I had heard him perform 100 times. What he laid out next was not petty theft. It was orchestrated annihilation. He wasn't simply funneling operating funds into Delaware shell companies to quietly bleed Langford development dry. He was engineering a total, catastrophic detonation of everything I had spent my life building. Gavin had been holding secret negotiations with Sterling Horizon Group, my oldest, most cutthroat corporate rival, for a backroom hostile takeover. 40 years I had gone toe-to-toe with Sterling over every major commercial zoning contract in the Houston metropolitan area, and now my own stepson was handing them the front door key. Gavin was arranging to sell my entire commercial real estate portfolio to Sterling for a fraction of what it was worth, practically giving it away. He was deliberately driving the company's valuation into the ground to make a fast, clean liquidation impossible to resist. His reward for delivering my empire to my worst enemy, an untraceable astronomical kickback. I listened as he rattled off routing numbers for a chain of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, his tone dripping with self-satisfaction. Sterling Horizon Group was quietly wiring him exactly $20 million in untaxed, invisible funds for his corporate betrayal. Gavin bragged to Renee about how effortlessly he had managed the board of directors. By fabricating catastrophic quarterly losses, he would steer the executive committee toward the conclusion that selling to Sterling was the only remaining option before total collapse. He was engineering a manufactured panic, and my supposed mental deterioration served as the perfect cover story for the company's sudden, inexplicable vulnerability. The board would fold without question. Renee let out a high, delighted laugh, a sound that scraped against my eardrums like shattered glass. She showered him with praise, feeding his ego with a devotion that turned my stomach. Then the conversation pivoted back to me. They began mocking my deteriorating condition, openly laughing at how completely I had surrendered control. Renee described her nightly ritual with chilling pride. She explained in careful detail how she ground the heavy sedatives into fine powder, using a marble mortar and pestle, then dissolved the residue in a splash of warm water. From there, she would fold the toxic solution into my fresh orange juice, noting with satisfaction how the citrus pulp concealed every trace of the bitter chemical beneath it. She called me a pathetic, trusting old fool, said it was almost too easy. She recounted with visible glee the moment I dropped my pen during the legal mediation session earlier that week. She described the deep satisfaction of watching my hands tremble, knowing she was the one causing it, the architect of my physical unraveling. Gavin joined in the laughter, commenting on how readily I had accepted the story of my own mental collapse. They were nearly giddy about it. They had taken my love, my trust, my age, all of it, and fashioned it into a weapon against me, made my slow decline into a private running joke. The degree of sociopathy required to poison a man while holding his hand at dinner was beyond comprehension. And yet here I was, hearing every word of it in high-definition audio. My hands balled into fists against the table knuckles, blanching white, but my breathing stayed even and controlled. Then Gavin laid out the final schedule. The Delaware transfers were nearly complete, and the Sterling Horizon buyout was set to close within the week. But to push the final asset transfer through, they needed me gone. Permanently. Not just under a conservatorship. Gavin explained that a temporary arrangement wouldn't be enough to get past the remaining skeptical board members. They needed me out of the picture entirely. No public presence, no voice. Renee enthusiastically agreed and described how she had already consulted with a thoroughly compromised private psychiatrist she had paid to cooperate. They had arranged for a specialized transport team to show up at my hotel early Monday morning. The plan was horrifyingly straightforward. Before I could utter a single word, I would be forcibly committed to a locked, high-security psychiatric facility. Renee explained that this particular facility was known for its heavily sedated residents and its total blackout on outside communication. Once those reinforced doors closed behind me, I would be legally designated a severe danger to myself. No phone, no attorney, not a single visitor without her explicit written authorization. Gavin added that the medical staff had already been given a full briefing on my violent episodes and advanced dementia. Any claim I made, any accusation of poisoning, of embezzlement, of any of it, would be logged as a textbook symptom of paranoid delusion. I could scream the unvarnished truth until my throat gave out, and my captors would simply increase my sedation until there was nothing left to scream. I would be erased. With me sealed away in a locked ward, Gavin would hold full legal authority to execute the final transfer of property deeds to Sterling Horizon Group. Once the signatures dried and the offshore payments cleared the international monitors, their exit plan would launch. Gavin walked through their escape route. They weren't planning to linger in Houston and enjoy what they had stolen. They knew Clifford Dunning or some other loyalist might eventually piece things together, so they had already secured secondary passports. They were leaving the country the following Friday, disappearing to a luxury villa they had privately acquired in a remote, lawless stretch of South America. They would vanish completely, spending the rest of their lives in ease and comfort, while I decayed alone in a cold institutional room. The recording ended with the sound of their crystal glasses meeting in a toast, celebrating the brilliant future they had engineered. Then static. Silence. I reached up and pulled the headphones off slowly, setting them on the glass table. I didn't move for a long while. I sat in the low light of the hotel suite and let the full, staggering enormity of what they had built sink in. They had constructed an airtight, inescapable trap designed to strip me of my fortune, my liberty, and my mind. They had never seen me as a husband or a father. I was an obstacle, a temporary one, to be systematically dismantled and thrown away. The betrayal was so total, so fundamentally corrupt, that whatever thread of emotional attachment I had left for either of them was severed completely and finally. They had handed me a deadline. 5 days. 5 days before the transport team knocked on my door. 5 days to dismantle everything they had built, piece by piece, and burn it to ash. I studied the glowing laptop screen. There was one more audio file in the encrypted folder. Brock had delivered a short recording captured just as Gavin and Renee were wrapping up and preparing to leave the executive suite. I paused for just a moment, staring at the small play icon on the screen. Everything inside me, body, mind, nerve, was already pushed past the edge of what a person can absorb. The financial treason, the affair, all of it. I did not want to pull those plastic headphones back over my ears. I did not want to hear another syllable of their smug, poisonous voices rattling around inside my skull. But the primal, protective instinct that had roared awake in me demanded complete and total clarity. I had to know every last piece of their endgame. There was one thing, one that mattered to me more than my real estate empire, more than my wealth, more than my freedom. I needed to know whether they had talked about her. I lifted the headphones, eased them on, and hit play one final time. The audio crackled with the ambient quiet of a dark, late-night office. I heard the unmistakable sound of Gavin feeding his arms into the sleeves of his tailored jacket, readying himself to leave. "Are we entirely sure we have covered every single loose end?" Gavin's voice carried a slight echo in the empty room. "The corporate accounts are draining perfectly on schedule. The Sterling Horizon buyout is completely locked in. The psychiatric transport team is confirmed for early Monday morning. Is there absolutely anything else we are forgetting to handle before we leave for the private airport on Friday?" A brief, chilling silence answered him. Then Renee spoke. The breathless, seductive warmth she had carried moments before was nowhere in her voice. It was flat, annoyed, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We need to figure out exactly what we are going to do with Nora," she said. Hearing my 10-year-old daughter's name fall from that treacherous woman's lips sent a violent shock wave tearing through every nerve in my body. Gavin sighed heavily into the microphone, sounding for all the world as if they were discussing a minor scheduling headache, a delayed construction delivery, a misfiled tax return. "Right," he muttered dismissively. "The kid. We cannot exactly leave her alone in that enormous estate the moment the old man gets hauled off to the locked psychiatric ward. The state will immediately dispatch some nosy caseworker to the property. They will start asking the wrong questions at exactly the wrong time while the wire transfers are still clearing the international monitors." Renee let out a sharp, contemptuous scoff that turned the blood in my veins to ice. "Don't lose any sleep over the brat," she said, her voice soaked in pure, undiluted venom. "I have already taken care of every necessary arrangement. The instant the old man is locked away and the court formally declares him legally incompetent, I am exercising my full authority as her custodial stepmother. I have already enrolled her in a remote, obscure disciplinary boarding school, situated just outside of Geneva. The facility deals exclusively with severely troubled children with documented behavioral problems. It functions essentially as a high-altitude juvenile detention center with ironclad communication blackouts. She goes on a direct, unescorted commercial flight to Switzerland first thing Tuesday morning. And what if she makes a scene?" Gavin asked, a thread of concern creeping into his voice. "What if she starts screaming to the boarding school staff that we deliberately poisoned her father?" Renee laughed, a hollow, cruel, soulless sound that bounced off the walls of the empty office. "Let her talk," she sneered. "She is nothing but a grieving, deeply traumatized little girl who supposedly just watched her father's mind get eaten alive by dementia. Not a single soul will believe one desperate word out of her mouth," she continued. "They will sedate her and put her in a dark dormitory. And honestly, Gavin, if the Swiss school somehow refuses to keep her, or if the international travel logistics get too tangled before our Friday flight, I will simply sign my guardianship rights over to the state foster system. I do not care what becomes of her. I am completely finished pretending to be a loving mother to his pathetic little spawn." The audio cut off abruptly, a sharp click, as the executive suite lights went dark, followed immediately by the deep, resonant thud of a solid mahogany door swinging shut. I sat completely still in the dim light of my hotel room. The silence settling over the beige walls was not empty. It was dense and suffocating, pressing down on me under the full, incomprehensible weight of their cruelty. They weren't only planning to gut every last thing I had spent my life building. They weren't only planning to seal me inside a sterile psychiatric ward to waste away until my heart gave out. They were going to discard my little girl like she was garbage, disposable, worthless nothing. They intended to exile a brilliant, innocent, loving 10-year-old child to a disciplinary prison on the other side of the ocean, or simply hand her off to an overburdened state foster system without a second thought. My breathing slowed on its own, settling into a deep, measured, almost frightening rhythm. The nausea and the dizzying disorientation that had seized me earlier had completely dissolved. In their place came something far more dangerous. A total, absolute calm that spread through me like ice water through a still pipe. Every last trace of mercy, every microscopic hesitation or flicker of pity I might have held onto for the woman I had once called my wife, or for the boy I had raised as my own son, evaporated entirely and permanently. They had crossed a line that no human being under any conceivable circumstances could ever step back from. My sweet Nora had put herself at risk to slip that desperate warning into my coat pocket. She had seen the monsters living behind the polished faces in our home, and she had been brave enough to try to save my life. Now it fell to me without question, without hesitation, to save hers. I reached across the table and took hold of the cheap, disposable cell phone sitting on the glass surface. I had already made up my mind I was not waiting 5 more days. I was not spending another minute cowering in this grim hotel room. The legal trap had been constructed with precision, fully baited and wired directly into federal banking monitors. I dialed Clifford Dunning's restricted burner number. He picked up on the second ring, his gruff, seasoned voice steady and unhurried in the late-night quiet. "Clifford," I said, and my voice carried a cold, lethal certainty I hadn't felt in more than 6 months. "We are scrapping the timeline and moving everything up. The waiting is done as of right now. I need you to trigger the banking alerts immediately. Spring the trap." Clifford didn't ask a single question. He confirmed the new orders and ended the call. The hidden machinery we had built together locked into gear, and the collision that had been coming for months began accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. The following morning, the beige walls of the hotel room gave way to the imposing, polished oak panels of the county courthouse. The courtroom air was heavy with a stiff, manufactured solemnity. I sat at the defendant's table posture, deliberately sagging hands resting limp in my lap, wearing the same slightly oversized, wrinkled suit from the mediation session. The illusion had to hold until the very last possible second. Across the aisle, Renee and Gavin sat on either side of their lead attorney. They looked like a perfect, grief-stricken family portrait. Renee had chosen a conservative navy dress, her makeup calibrated to project sleepless worry. Gavin sat rigid and upright, performing the image of a dutiful, burdened son facing an impossible situation. They believed they were walking into a formality, a rubber stamp from a sympathetic judge to put the final seal on their complete victory. They had no idea they had just stepped into a slaughterhouse. The presiding judge, a stern, silver-haired man draped in a heavy black judicial robe, studied the towering stack of files on his bench. Renee's lead counsel, a sharp and aggressively expensive litigator named Warren, took his position at the podium and launched into his opening remarks. His practiced voice rolled through the high-ceilinged room, saturated with a carefully engineered sorrow. He spent considerable time praising my legacy, 4 decades of dominance in competitive commercial real estate, before pivoting sharply into a disturbing account of my sudden and catastrophic mental decline. He formally submitted the conservatorship petition, sliding a thick file of completely fabricated medical evaluations across the polished wood. He cited multiple consultations with private psychiatrists, cataloging my invented symptoms with cold, clinical detail. He walked the court through the sudden memory failures, the uncontrollable physical tremors, the acute paranoia, the erratic and dangerous behavior that supposedly threatened not just my own well-being but the stability of a billion-dollar corporation. Warren painted the portrait of a towering intellect, completely ravaged by an aggressive and untreatable early dementia. He formally petitioned the court to strip me of every legal, financial, and personal right I held and transfer that authority entirely to my devoted wife and my highly capable stepson. I sat through the full performance without moving a single muscle. No protest, no denial, no shake of the head. I kept my eyes fixed on the bare wooden table in front of me and absorbed every fabricated word they were etching into the permanent court record. The judge quietly called for a primary character witness to corroborate the medical claims laid out in the petition. Warren immediately called Gavin to the stand. My stepson rose, buttoned his expensive tailored jacket with deliberate composure, and made his way unhurriedly to the witness box. He raised his right hand, swore a solemn oath to tell the truth under full penalty of perjury, and settled into the chair. What followed was a performance so precisely calibrated, so utterly hollow beneath its polished surface, that it bordered on the terrifying. Gavin looked directly at the judge, his eyes filling with what appeared to be genuine tears, but were anything but. His voice came out in a careful, trembling hesitation as he described how deeply he loved me. He told the courtroom how I had raised him since childhood, taught him everything he knew about international business, and served as the greatest hero of his life. He paused at the right moment, dabbing a stray tear from his cheek with a crisp white handkerchief, before describing the shattering anguish of watching his beloved hero slowly come apart. He recounted entirely invented violent episodes with passionate conviction moments, where I had supposedly forgotten my own name, wandered the estate in a blind, disoriented panic in the dead of night, and lashed out at the nursing staff Renee had supposedly hired for my protection. He pleaded with the judge to understand that this drastic legal action came from nothing but desperate, devoted family love. He argued they needed full control of my assets solely to fund long-term care in a secure, specialized psychiatric facility. He was lying straight through his teeth, spinning a fraudulent and deeply manipulative story while bound by a sworn federal oath. With every poisonous syllable that left his mouth, he was committing deliberate knowing perjury, and I let him keep going without making a sound. I sat in that hard wooden chair and watched him cheerfully dig his own grave with a golden shovel. I knew that the crystal-clear audio recordings of him and Renee laughing together about crushing sedatives into my evening orange juice were sitting safely inside Clifford Dunning's battered leather briefcase just a few feet behind me in the crowded gallery. I knew the official toxicology reports, fully authenticated, detailing the dangerous levels of heavy metals and off-market synthetic sedatives running through my bloodstream, were sealed and ready to be opened. I knew the Federal Banking Commission had already frozen the offshore accounts, holding Gavin's illicit $20 million kickback. I knew every single thing they were certain I didn't know. I let Gavin spin his elaborate, revolting web of lies, because the penalty for attempting to steal a corporation was already severe. But the penalty for organized embezzlement, attempted homicide, and felony perjury was something else entirely, absolute, inescapable ruin. Gavin finally brought his tragic monologue to a close, lowering his head and weeping softly into his hands. Renee released a quiet, well-timed sob from the petitioner's table, pressing her fingertips to eyes that were completely dry. The entire courtroom held its breath, captivated by the flawless theatrical performance unfolding before it. Even the veteran court reporter appeared genuinely moved. The judge exhaled a long, heavy breath, adjusting his silver glasses as he peered down at me from the elevated bench. His weary eyes carried a deep, crushing pity. He saw exactly what they had arranged for him to see: a shattered, hollow, senile old man, no longer capable of managing his own affairs or protecting his own fortune. He gathered the conservatorship documents into a neat stack, tapping the edges against the wood to align them. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel, cleared his throat, and prepared to deliver the ruling that would permanently strip me of my freedom, my wealth, and whatever future I had left. He was about to bring that gavel down and end my life as a free man, entirely unaware that the real trial hadn't started yet. The gavel hung suspended in the charged, silent air. The judge drew a breath, his expression full of solemn finality, as he readied the fatal blow. I squared my shoulders, my hand moving toward the pocket where my audio drive was concealed. I was 1 second from triggering my entire defense when a small, determined voice rang out from the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery. "Wait, please, wait!" The judge's arm stopped in midair. Every head in the courtroom swiveled at once towards the interruption. Standing in the center aisle, clutching a battered blue tablet to her chest, was my 10-year-old daughter, Nora. Next to her stood a stern state social worker, almost certainly brought by Renee to handle Nora's immediate transfer into the foster system. Nora looked impossibly small inside that imposing chamber, but her dark eyes burned with a courage that had no business existing in a child that age. She took a hesitant step forward and looked directly up at the bench. "May I show you something that Dad does not know about your honor?" Nora asked, her voice trembling slightly, but carrying cleanly through the silence. The reaction from the petitioner's table was immediate and violent. Renee shot out of her chair with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. The carefully constructed mask of the grieving wife dissolved instantly, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. She let out a guttural scream and lunged across the aisle, reaching desperately to rip the tablet from my daughter's hands, but she never cleared the swinging gate. The armed bailiff moved with terrifying speed, cutting her off. He planted an authoritative hand squarely on Renee's chest and drove her back until she stumbled and fell heavily into her seat. "Sit down and remain silent, ma'am," the bailiff commanded with complete authority. The judge set his gavel down softly on the desk. The pity that had filled his eyes moments before was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused, judicial attention. He had clearly recognized the unmistakable terror radiating from Renee's sweat-slicked face. He leaned forward and looked down at my daughter with a remarkably measured gentleness. You may approach the bench, young lady," the judge said quietly, brushing aside Warren's frantic legal objections entirely. "Bailiff, please assist the child with the equipment." I sat frozen at the defendant's table, my heart slamming against my ribs. I had spent 5 days constructing an airtight trap, assembling audio recordings and medical documentation. I had absolutely no idea what my daughter was holding in her trembling hands. Nora passed my table and gave me a small, brave smile before walking toward the stand. The bailiff took the tablet from her gently and connected the cables to the courtroom's display system. 4 large digital screens hanging from the ceiling flickered and came to life. Nora reached forward and pressed a single button. The footage began to play immediately. It was slightly grainy, framed with a soft, rounded border, but the image was unmistakably clear. I recognized the expensive marble countertops and the custom cherry-wood cabinetry in an instant. It was the main kitchen of our estate. The camera angle was distinctive, elevated, fixed, looking downward. It was recording through the glass eye of the brown teddy bear I had won for Nora years earlier, the same bear she always kept perched beside the fruit bowl on the counter. The timestamp in the corner showed the footage had been captured nearly 3 months earlier, late in the evening. The courtroom watched in complete silence as Renee walked casually into frame. She was wearing her deep navy silk robe, her hair pulled back in a loose knot. She crossed to the medicine cabinet, but she didn't reach for the vitamin bottles. Instead, she reached behind a row of ceramic mugs and drew out a small amber vial. A horrified gasp rippled through the gallery as Renee tipped a cluster of thick white pills into a heavy marble mortar. The microphone captured the sharp, grinding rhythm of the pestle as she reduced the medication to a fine powder. She poured a tall glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, then scraped every last granule of the toxic substance directly into the liquid. She took a spoon and stirred the poisonous mixture with a sickeningly ordinary, casual motion. Before she could lift the glass, the kitchen door swung quietly open. Gavin strolled into the wide frame of the camera, wearing his tailored business suit, silk tie slightly loosened. He moved up behind her, sliding his arms possessively around her waist. The entire courtroom watched in revulsion as Renee turned into his embrace. They kissed deeply, intimately, and the moment shattered the entire fiction of the family dynamic they had performed for months. The reality of their affair was now playing across 4 massive screens inside a federal courthouse. Gavin pulled back from the embrace, an arrogant smirk cutting across his face. His gaze dropped to the tall glass of tainted orange juice on the marble counter, and his eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. He reached out casually, dragging one finger along the damp rim of the glass. "When the old man's brain completely rots, I will sign the estate over to you." Gavin laughed, his voice thick with concentrated malice. The video ended. The screens went black all at once. The courtroom was plunged into a deafening, suffocating silence. The judge sat motionless behind the bench. The color had drained from his face entirely. His expression had hardened into a rigid mask of horror and professional outrage. He stared at the dark monitors, both hands gripping the edge of his desk, until his knuckles went white. I turned my head slowly and looked directly across the aisle. The polished, untouchable front that Renee and Gavin had sustained for 6 months had been obliterated in under 2 minutes. Renee was shaking violently, her mouth opening and closing as she fought to pull air into her lungs. Her face had gone a sickly, translucent white, completely drained of color and life. She looked like a corpse, propped rigidly upright in a tailored navy dress. Gavin was in a state of total, catastrophic collapse. The polished, supremely confident young executive who had delivered a flawlessly perjured, tearful testimony just minutes before was simply gone. He dropped backward into his padded leather chair, his legs giving out beneath him entirely. He stared blankly at the dark screens, jaw hanging slack-chest, heaving with rapid, shallow, terrified breaths. His expensive corporate attorney Warren physically recoiled from his own clients, taking one long, deliberate step away from the petitioner's table, as though he had abruptly realized he was standing far too close to something highly contagious. The trap had been fully and finally sprung, not by my highly paid private investigators or my elite corporate legal team, but by the unbroken courage of a 10-year-old girl who simply refused to let her father be destroyed without a fight. The suffocating stillness in the courtroom shattered into total, uncontrollable chaos the moment the massive screens faded to black. I rose slowly from the heavy walnut defense table. My hands were completely steady. My posture was straight, shoulders squared with a strength I had reclaimed, my eyes locked on Gavin and Renee with the cold, surgical precision of a man who had just won a war he had fought alone in the dark. I turned slightly and gave a firm, barely visible nod to my lead attorney, Clifford Dunning. Clifford stepped forward without hesitation, opened his battered leather briefcase, and drew out a thick stack of documents, dropping them with a resounding thud onto the judge's elevated bench. The sound cut through the rising panic in the gallery like a hammer blow. These were not fabricated psychiatric evaluations. They were the certified toxicology reports establishing the lethal chemical levels in my bloodstream, the offshore banking records tracing the $20 million kickback, and the irrevocable trust instruments securing the full breadth of my corporate holdings. Your Honor, Clifford said, his commanding voice slicing cleanly through the frantic noise from opposing counsel. My client is not suffering from any form of dementia. He is the deliberate victim of systematic long-term chemical poisoning, international wire fraud, and calculated attempted murder. Before Renee's expensive attorney could get his mouth open to produce even a stammering objection, the heavy doors at the rear of the courtroom flew open with a violent crash. 2 federal agents and a senior investigator from the Financial Crimes Division walked in with the unhurried confidence of people who already knew how this was going to end. Clifford had quietly delivered the pristine audio recordings and digital audit logs to them 3 days earlier, ensuring the trap had no exit. Gavin spotted the federal badges and came apart instantly. He lurched out of his chair and made a desperate break toward the side emergency exit. He didn't clear 3 steps. The bailiff launched forward and brought my stepson down hard onto the polished marble floor with a heavy, sickening impact. Renee collapsed back into her seat, her composure disintegrating completely. She began screaming, her voice fracturing, as she pleaded with me to tell them it had all been some terrible misunderstanding. She reached for that same smooth, honeyed tone she had used while handing me poison juice, the voice designed to make me feel safe while she dismantled me. I didn't so much as glance in her direction. I stood exactly where I was, my face carved from stone, and watched her lies come apart piece by piece. The presiding judge brought his gavel down hard, snapping the room back to order. He revoked every one of Renee's temporary legal rights on the spot, granted me full and sole protective custody of Nora, and signed the federal arrest warrants without a moment's pause. I stood in cold silence and watched the steel handcuffs click shut around Renee's trembling wrists. I watched as Gavin, the arrogant boy I had personally shaped and foolishly trusted with everything I had built, was physically removed from the courtroom in humiliated, broken tears. He was now staring down decades in federal prison for racketeering, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. They had genuinely believed they were burying a confused, helpless old man. Instead, they had spent months digging their own inescapable graves. With the federal agents clearing the room of the people who had tried to destroy me, I walked slowly to the wooden witness box and dropped to one knee on the floor. I opened my arms and pulled my brilliant little girl into a tight, desperate embrace, pressing my face into her shoulder as she wept with profound relief. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This story took something out of me to carry, and I'm grateful you carried it alongside me. Looking back on everything, the poisoned mornings, the courtroom, the moment Nora walked through those heavy doors, I understand now that the road through that kind of betrayal doesn't leave you unchanged. It costs you something permanent. But I believe God placed that little girl in my life, not just to be loved, but to be the one who would stand up when I no longer could. His timing, even when it feels unbearably slow, has a precision that no amount of human scheming can outrun. Here is what I want to leave with you. Pay attention to the quiet ones in your life. Children see more than adults give them credit for, and they carry warnings we are too proud or too afraid to hear. If something in your body is telling you something is wrong, trust it. Seek a second opinion. Demand answers. Your instincts exist for a reason. Never mistake patience for weakness. Holding your ground while you build your case is not surrender, it is strategy. And if someone is trying to take from you what you built with your own hands, do not panic and do not collapse. Document everything. Find the people who are truly loyal. Let the truth do what threats never can. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. A friend, a parent, anyone who has ever felt like the walls were closing in. And if you haven't already subscribed to Dad Revenge, there are more stories here, and every single one of them matters. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.